Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Phil Arno, and yes, I'm not in my studio. I'm in the office of Western New York's version of Perry Mason. Paul Cambria, Jr. is our guest today, and we're talking about a trial that is taking a lot of attention in the news. It's making a lot of headlines. Donald Trump is on trial down in New York City, and it's taking him away from the campaign trail. Let's talk a little bit about what this trial is all about and whether it has any merit and what the prospects are. Paul, welcome to the show.
My pleasure.
My first question, let's start out with the judge, okay? Before we get into the trial itself, the judge, there's been some questions about the judge. His campaign donations have gone to Democrats and President Biden in the past. His daughter has been an official in the campaign for Kamala Harris, and then after that for Biden and Harris when they were running in the 2020 election. So he's got close ties to, politically speaking, to Donald Trump's adversaries. Would that, under New York judicial policy, call for him to recuse himself in a trial that involves Donald Trump?
Well, I mean, he could, but it's up to him. The way that works is that the judge who you're asking to recuse is the one who makes the decision as to whether they're going to recuse. And so, I'm sure that his position is, I can be fair, I can be impartial, that's all you're entitled to. Whatever happens with my family members and so on is not something that will enter into the case, and time will tell. There's a record. If he makes decisions that are improper, an appellate court will be the remedy. They'll be able to reverse it. So that's the check and balance.
How subjective is this whole thing? Because we're talking about, you're saying that the judge is going to make his own decision, but if he's biased, obviously that decision doesn't have to necessarily be the correct decision.
Yeah, that's true. And the remedy would be to, if Trump's convicted, that would be one of his issues he would raise on appeal as to whether the judge should have been recused, or whether or not the judge was actually fair. There's a record here of everything the judge does and says, and so an appellate court can review that and decide whether what he did was fair and impartial.
In New York, the standards for judges in recusing themselves is that if there's a conflict of interest or even the appearance of a conflict.
Appearance, that's right. If there's an appearance, and if this judge has obviously decided that, because his daughter, relative, or whatever is politically active or connected, that doesn't disqualify him from being fair and impartial. And, it remains to be seen if an appellate court agrees with that.
Well, getting to the trial itself, Alvin Bragg brought these charges against Trump, and to my understanding, the charges include felony charges for falsifying information on a document. What I've heard, and you'll have to clarify this, that would normally be a misdemeanor in this instance unless it was done to cover up some kind of a crime.
Separate crime.
A separate crime. And they haven't really specified what crime. No crime has been charged against Trump. He hasn't been convicted of any crime. Is that a kind of a stretch?
Well, my guess is that they filed a so-called bill of particulars, but they've identified what underlying crimes they intend to say were committed by this act. If there are no underlying crimes and it's a false business entry, it's a misdemeanor. If there are other separate crimes that were being facilitated, if you will, then it becomes a felony. Here, we're told that the two crimes that they are claiming occurred, one was basically an illegal contribution to his campaign, because they're saying that the so-called hush money paid to Stormy Daniels actually was an illegal campaign contribution.
Is it within their purview to try to prove a crime that isn't within this particular case?
Well, my guess is that they have identified the underlying crimes that they claim were committed. And they would do that. It would either be in the indictment, which apparently it's not in the indictment, or it would be in the so-called bill of particulars. And they would specify it. And from all the information I've had a chance to read, the two that they're looking at is, one, money paid to Stormy Daniels was really an illegal campaign contribution, or number two, it was an entry made and described as a business deduction, which would be payment to his lawyer when it really was a payoff to a witness. And so it was mischaracterized as a business expense, which would legitimately be something that you could deduct. And it wasn't that. It was actually a payment to her to keep her quiet. So there are two theories to get to the felony: illegal campaign contribution, or number two, an improperly characterized business expense, and it's not a business expense. So one or the other.
In your experience, is this is this kind of thing ever done? Is this kind of charge ever brought against business people?
There are false business record charges every year leveled against people, where they say that they mischaracterized something that they've deducted and it really wasn't a legitimate business expense. That happens all the time. In this context, however, of election fraud, I can't even think of the last time that we've seen a case like this, especially at this level. And so basically they're saying, look, the money you paid was to keep her quiet. By doing that, you influenced your federal election because you eliminated controversy that may have cost you the election. So therefore, it's an illegal contribution related to the election. That's an interesting theory. The second part is a little easier, I think, which is if you listed that money as payment to your lawyer, which would be a legitimate expense, when it really was hush money to a potential witness, when it wouldn't be a legitimate expense, then, that is something that probably is more solid from the standpoint of the prosecution than the first one, which is the contribution to a campaign. So, I think that's the horse they're going to ride here the hardest, is they're going to say, this wasn't any legitimate expense, this was a payoff.
It is a payoff under normal circumstances. Just take the election away. If he was trying to preserve his personal image and
Sure.
protect his marriage, and say,
that's not a crime.
That's not a crime.
That's not a crime. However, if you try to deduct that from your taxes by saying that it's a legitimate business expense, that's where the problem comes in. Because then they say, because here what they're saying is, you made it look like it was a lawyer payment. It really wasn't a lawyer payment. It was a payment to hush up a witness. That's the difference. So it became an undeductible, if you will, amount of money, as opposed to a legitimate business deductible expense.
It seems there's a lot of complications to the state's case. In one of the things that the defense has is a statement by Stormy Daniels saying that she never received any payoff to keep her quiet from Donald Trump. They have to prove he paid his attorney, then his attorney in turn turned around and paid Stormy Daniels, and then they have to prove that it was election related. There's a lot of ifs.
Well,
in
they
this.
just have to prove that it wasn't a legitimate business expense. That's for the second theory. For the first theory, they have to prove that it was an illegal contribution to the campaign. Okay, there are two different things. I think the first one is easier to prove, that it wasn't a legitimate expense, it was a payoff. And if you've characterized it as, a retainer paid to Cohen, when it really was hush money paid to Daniels, that's where the problem is. And that appears to be the easier path for the prosecution than to say that it's a contribution to his campaign.
There is a crime that was covered up which justifies the felony
Well,
charge.
it would be a crime if you said something was a legitimate business expense and it wasn't. And you deducted it. You actually expensed that money. That really is that's easily a crime. You mischaracterized it as legal fees when it really wasn't legal fees. It was payoff money. That's where they are here.
It's interesting. I mean, we have other things that we can talk about in terms of the politics of this, the timing of it, and then there's three other trials or potential trials that can be talked about.
Yeah, they've loaded him up.
Yeah, it's unusual
to get him off get him. It's interesting that really none of these disqualify him as a presidential candidate.
Right. And that's another issue. If he's a convicted felon and becomes president,
he can be.
Yeah. How does that? Can he pardon himself? That's
another issue. There was those discussions were had before whether or not he'd be in a position to pardon himself. I doubt it. I doubt that the courts would interpret the pardon power that way. But the other thing to me, what's interesting is apparently there are two lawyers on the jury, and what will be interesting is whether first of all, what kind of lawyers they are. Are they civil lawyers? Are they criminal lawyers? And secondly, will they be in a position to pick apart the nuances of these charges? For example, say, well, really isn't a campaign contribution, so that's out. Now we're down to expense. And is this a legitimate expense? For example, is it a publicity expense? Publicity expense in connection with a campaign may very well be legitimate.
Well, as a businessman, if he wants to preserve his image, is that a legitimate?
Well, that definitely would be an argument.
I mean, sure. Is that legitimate? I mean,
that would definitely be an argument.
Okay, well, we'll discuss this when we come back. We're out of time for this segment, but there's a lot to be considered on this. It's not the usual case in any way, shape, or form. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to The Big Picture. We're talking about the Trump trial, the current Trump trial, and my guest is Paul Cambria. We've kind of talked about the charges and the judge, the timing of this. The charges are involved in things that have happened in 2015, 2016, possibly 2017. Here we are in 2024. How unusual is it for charges to kind of linger and be non-existent until, 6 years later, 5, 6, 7 years later?
I guess it depends on what your goal is. If your goal is to stop Trump from becoming the president, then you do everything you can to get him charged and to have the public reject him or have him get convicted, sentenced to jail, you know, all those possibilities. The timing, as far as I'm concerned, is simply because there's an election coming up, and they'd like to not see him be the president again.
So in the real world, this is not so much about Trump's wrongdoing as it is about him running for president.
Well, I mean, you know, some people would argue that both those things are in play. He's doing things that he shouldn't be doing, and therefore he shouldn't be the president. Or we don't want him to be the president, so we're going to say what he was doing was wrong. You know, whatever it takes to get to the goal.
But if he wasn't running for president, he wouldn't be charged with 91 counts across the country in different jurisdictions.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good assumption that if he wasn't running, that, you know, this wouldn't get as much exposure and traction as it's gotten.
And in each jurisdiction, these charges have been brought by Democrats in heavily Democratic voting districts, and you know, by officials that are, you know, very liberal and could be described as not as biased. Is this, in your opinion anyway, and you're quite experienced in the legal system, is this an abuse of the legal system?
Well, I mean, there are going to be lots and lots of people who think so, going to say, come on, you know, this is obvious. You don't want him to be president, so you're going to do everything possible to stop him. You're in control, and so you have the ability to do it, and you're doing it. And it's politically motivated. And, you know, I mean, that's clearly a position that people are going to take. And some others may say, well, wait a minute. You know, this guy manipulated the election. He paid off witnesses. And so he should be punished for it. Again, if there wasn't a presidential election, I don't think these charges would see the light of day.
Under the circumstances, with all this in mind, would it be appropriate for a higher court to become involved? And if so, at what point would a higher court?
Well, it's very unusual for an appellate court to interfere at the first level, the trial level. There are certain circumstances, but they're pretty rare, okay? They might move a case from this place to that place because they need a change of venue. You know, you can't get, there's too much publicity, too much connection, that kind of thing. But to actually interfere and say, you rendered an indictment and we're going to just stop it because we don't think it's fair, you rarely ever see that. I can't even think of an example of that. And so the remedy is, all right, go through the process, and then you'll come to the appellate court. Appellate court will look at the full record and decide whether or not there's reversible error. That's the check and balance here. There are two appellate stages after the trial stage. And so there are two chances to make it right if it was wrong.
The current trial that we've been talking about, they're estimating it's going to take a couple of months to get through it.
It doesn't look like that kind of case. They only have a few witnesses. You know, the charges are pretty, it's not like there's 100 counts here or something like that. I don't see that. I think like in 2 weeks this thing will be over.
Well, they're saying as much as a couple of months if they do want to prevent him from being president. And part of that strategy is to keep him off of the campaign trail for as long as they can. Can they drag this out for a couple of months?
Well, that's up again. Now we have a judge that is the person overseeing all of this. And the judge can say, move on, or you've already done that, or this is repetitive. And, there are all sorts of things the judge can do to expedite the proceedings.
The judge has ordered that Trump has to be in the courtroom every day of the trial. Is that normal?
Yeah, that's normal. I mean, the only time that they separate the defendant from physical presence is when the defendant is, obstructive. Mm-hmm. Then they can put them in a separate room where they can watch it and hear it, but they can't interfere with it by yelling and, whatever kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So to have him there every day, no, and he should be there every day. Any defense lawyer would tell him, the last thing you want to do is treat this like a joke and not be here. Mm-hmm. You need to be here. And you need to care.
And Trump has said that he wants to testify.
Well, he's that sort of guy that figures he can talk his way out of whatever. And, in a case like this, it probably makes a lot of sense for him to testify. The question is, what kind of witness would he be? Because he's used to just doing what he wants to do. And so will he argue with the cross-examiner? And that's what the prosecution would love, to have him get in there and argue with them and so on. Will he be contrite? Will he be controlled? That's a hard one. If he's smart, he would be. And simply get up. And, when they start asking him questions like, well, you paid this money because you didn't want to hurt your campaign or whatever. I mean, his response to that is going to be, well, A, it never happened. Apparently he's taken that position. And B, no, I was more concerned about my family and their feelings, and I have young children and, all that stuff. Without actually being there and knowing all the facts and the ins and outs of the case, it's hard for somebody like me on the outside to say, oh, he should testify or he shouldn't testify. I've had them both ways. I've had cases where you wouldn't think in a million years somebody should testify, and I worked with them, and they testified, and it was the right thing to do. And I've had a lot of cases where, in my opinion, look, the government can't prove this case, and I'm not going to do it for them by putting the defendant on the stand. And I say that because when the defendant gets on the stand, they are observed. Every little twitch, turn, etc., all of a sudden takes on a meaning with jurors. And so you could have and snatch defeat from the jaws of victory by putting your defendant on the stand. I've had 50, 60 acquittals, and the defendant never took the stand.
Well, without having been involved in the case yourself and without having studied it, right, from what you know now, put on your prognosticator's hat, and what would your best guess be as to where this is going to go, and maybe even the other cases as well. But, what are we looking for?
Well, a lot of it's going to depend upon how the witnesses do. How's Cohen as a witness? He obviously is upset with Trump and wants to exact some revenge. Will he be good? Will he be bad? How about Stormy Daniels? Will she convince the jury that, they never did have a relationship? It's kind of interesting. I was at an event that she was at, and I started talking to her just, out of pure old curiosity to see if I could get her to say something one way or the other, just, a comment or whatever. But she's pretty much buttoned down. And so it'll be interesting to see if she testifies and if she does what she will say. But before you got to should Trump testify, you want to see how all the witnesses did. And if you've slayed Cohen and she wasn't all that bad, quit. And say, look, presumed innocent, they've got the burden, they haven't carried the burden, and that's that. Sometimes you put your client on and you've given them a victory, the prosecution that they didn't have.
Well, we're about out of time now. We'll see how this plays out, and I'm sure with the other trials in play, and with the election coming up, there'll be plenty to talk about in the future. So
I think he'll fight hard to be a witness. Yeah. I think that's his nature.
Yeah, I think so as well.
It's a good idea.
He likes to be in control, and that's part of being in control.
Used to being in control.
So, okay, well, thank you very much, and that's it for this big picture. We'll see how this plays out, and we'll get back to this subject in future shows. Thanks very much for watching The Big Picture. Thanks for watching WBBZ-TV. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you next time on The Big Picture.